It's September 4th, 1607, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Nowadays, there's nothing unusual about Irish people heading to Spain in the late summer. Who can blame them with a climate like theirs? But today in history in 1607, the departure in the dead of night of the Earl of Tyrconnell, Rory O'Donnell, and the Earl of Tyrone, Hugh O'Neill, and 90 of their staff and followers wasn't about catching some rays. It was about freeing themselves from restrictive English Protestant control.
Yeah, bad weather forced them to land in Normandy, but from there they proceeded overland to Rome, where they were received by the Spanish King Philip III, who did give them a house, but it's not entirely clear whether they had fled with the express purpose of seeking allies for an uprising against the English. That's one argument. Several of them, though, had left their wives behind, which seems to suggest they didn't think that they would be in danger being left behind in Ireland, and that they would either return to Ireland at some point or they would send for their wives later. O'Donnell left his pregnant wife Bridget, and O'Neill left his youngest son, Con, who would end up becoming a ward of the British Crown. He'd actually be educated at Eton and raised as a Protestant.
Yeah, all of this comes at the end of the 9 Years' War, which was fought between an Irish confederation, led mainly by Irish lords, against English rule in Ireland, and was a response to the ongoing Tudor conquest of Ireland. And the conflict was actually so huge that at its height, England had sent around 18,000 soldiers to fight in Ireland, and it culminated in the Battle of Kinsale in October of 1601. Unfortunately for the Irish Earls, the battle resulted in an English victory, and the Irish forces then retreated north.
Yeah, I mean, if the word Earls isn't giving this away, this was the Irish aristocracy, essentially. And in fact, today in history, when they left, this was effectively all of the Irish aristocracy that was left abandoning their homeland. The O'Donnells, as a family, had been in power since the 13th century, so you can imagine how that felt for the Gaelic people who were left behind. But it's hard to follow with Irish history because there's like generations of O'Neills and O'Donnells who are different to the O'Neill and O'Donnell that I mentioned in the intro. But Red Hugh O'Neill, who was the Hugh who fled today's dad, alongside Hugh O'Donnell, who was Rory O'Neill's dad, and the Spanish, had led multiple uprisings against the English. It was a very hard-fought campaign to try and keep Irish laws, language, Catholicism, obviously. And in the end, after what you're describing, they effectively surrendered. They accepted earlships after the Treaty of Mellifont, where Queen Elizabeth had insisted that, basically because they were aristocrats, they should be offered a pardon. And, you know, so long as the Protestant church and the English state got a lot more access to a lot more of their territories, then they would be permitted to stay and sort of be Irish. So they were in this weird situation at this time in 1607 where it's not like, oh, the English are coming, let's get out of here. It was more like the years between that surrender and this day in history were a relentless grind where slowly their lands, their territories, their power, their church, their people felt like they were being subsumed by the English rule of Ireland.
Yeah, like, to be clear, these were feudal lords, and the peasants who worked on the land were essentially serfs, but most of them preferred to be ruled, obviously, by lords with whom they shared a religion and a language and a culture, and particularly in Ulster, because Ulster was the part of Ireland that the English colonists had sort of penetrated the least. So the native people there had retained a pretty traditional way of life. You know, they were organised into clans, they mostly lived as cattle herders, and the way that English settlers were kind of transforming the landscape into fenced-off agricultural land was totally incompatible with this lifestyle. Obviously, they spoke a different language. You know, they were imposing the Anglican religion because settlers were required to be Protestant. So to the native people of Ireland, those new overlords were totally alien. But as you mentioned, for the lords themselves, they actually secured what was considered very fair terms by the standards of the time.
An oven-ready Irish deal.
Yeah, quite. You know, the war had been fought very brutally. The Deputy Lord of Ireland, who was leading the English forces, Lord Mountjoy, he torched food stocks, he raised fields, you know, starving the population to submission. And this was seen as, the harsh measures weren't questioned because, as you mentioned, Queen Elizabeth was also fighting the Anglo-Spanish War at the time. So this two-war thing was becoming very unsustainable for the English crown. So they didn't stop short of using very harsh measures to force the Irish population into submission. And considering how brutal the war had been, like, the way it had ended was actually, you know, for the aristocracy in Ireland at least, pretty fair. The issue was that immediately after the end of the war, hostility towards Catholics in England increased rapidly.
Cross-reference our episode about the gunpowder plot.
Yeah, exactly. That was 1605.
Yeah, the English at this point are really in no mood to tolerate any whiff of Catholic dissent.
But also, even though there was a kind of leniency about the treatment of these newly forged earls who were sort of pardoned under the terms of the Treaty of the Malafont deal, there was still so much that they'd had to give up. They had to get rid of their Irish titles. They had to give up the Brehon laws, which was the legal system that dated back to the 7th century. They had to give up their private armies. That can't have been fun.
They had to consider sending their sons to Eton, the terror of it.
I know, awful. Yeah, the top hats alone. But they were also forced to swear an oath of allegiance to the English throne. So, it really wasn't a good situation for them. And basically, you're right, Rebecca. That this wasn't a moment of England being nice just because. It wasn't an act of great mercy on England's part. Actually, England was on the brink of bankruptcy, as you were talking about, and they'd been involved in too many wars simultaneously at the same time. And so negotiated peace agreement was kind of in England's interest as well.
Well, this is why I think when they then did flee on this day, if their intention was to raise an army and go back and take on the English, they were faced with foreign entities sort of shrugging their shoulders at them, because all of the countries of Europe were war-weary. It wasn't just England. No one wanted to have a fight with England, which is why they didn't last very long in Normandy, and they were quickly rushed out of there to the Spanish Netherlands. I mean, the French didn't want to be accused of harbouring them and start a fight with... Elizabeth wasn't around at this point anymore, was it? It was James I. And then the Netherlands and Spain, they already had multiple wars going on. They didn't want to have a war over Ireland. So I think the plan must have been that they wanted to go back. It does account for why they left some of their family there. But it also accounts for why, when they finally made it to the Vatican, as you said, King Philip provided them a house, but that really is all. Compared to perhaps, how they might have been treated by the English, they were treated well. But, look at this letter from the Spanish ambassador to the Vatican writing to the King of Spain the next year in 1608. I beg your majesty to give them some extra financial aid. Their grant is barely sufficient for their food, and in other respects they suffer great want. The Pope gives them a house, but not one stick of furniture, and they have neither beds nor chairs. The unfortunates have not money to buy such bare necessities, and as there are many Irish with the Earl, a large sum would be necessary to buy even what would be needed, so that they might not be forced to sleep on the floors.
Yeah, but O'Neill and O'Donnell had really sort of been forced into this position of having to flee because they were increasingly villainised both in England, which obviously had this sort of anti-Catholic panic/hysteria going on, and the Crown had also appointed at this point a new Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir Arthur Chichester, who launched a mass crackdown on Catholicism in Ireland. He saw it as sort of a fount of treason. He had a personal grudge against the Irish too. His brother John had been killed during the 9 Years' War, and Irish troops reportedly used his head as a football, so he wasn't coming in with a good attitude. He oversaw the project of turning the region into what was called the Plantation of Ulster, importing more and more settlers, especially from Scotland, hence the name of the dialect that emerged there, Ulster Scots, and sort of whittle away the lands of the native lords. But O'Neill and O'Donnell were also increasingly villainised by the Irish, particularly Irish lords who had allied themselves with the English during the 9 Years' War. And they were now wondering what was the point when the rebel lords had been treated so lightly and they'd been given back their lands, that the Irish aristocrats who had allied with the English were thinking, well, those will be our lands when the other aristocrats are defeated. That didn't happen. So they were also in danger in Ireland. And of course, the Irish population as well, looking at what was happening, these crackdowns on the Irish language and on Catholicism, the way that the lands were being whittled away and given away to English colonists. Nobody was a fan of the Earls at this point. And so when they were summoned to London for kind of like a mystery meeting with the king in 1607, it was a big fat no, at least from Rory O'Donnell, who was convinced nothing good could come from them going to London. Hugh O'Neill thought they should go. He thought they should plead their case personally to James I, who seemed to have a more sympathetic attitude towards Catholics than Queen Elizabeth, despite them trying to blow him up. I mean, after all, his mother was a Catholic, Mary Queen of Scots, but O'Donnell was insistent on leaving Ireland, and O'Neill realised that they either had to both stay or both go, because if one of them left, it would definitely definitely be seen as a plot to seek out reinforcements from Spain for a new rebellion. Spain had sent thousands of troops during the 9 Years' War to the Irish aristocracy, so they realised that they would really both have to go. And actually, O'Donnell, who was the one that wanted to leave, he died really soon after. He died in 1608, and O'Neill would live in Rome for another 8 years.
So the flight of the Earls is not just a big deal in Ireland, but it's recognised throughout Europe. And in 2008, the city of Rome celebrated the 400th anniversary of the Earls arriving there. And while the Earls arrived in Rome as just a party of 90, there are now millions of Irish people living across Europe. You've kind of got this real literal connection of this moment where this important body of Irish people arrived in Rome.
So everyone celebrates by having a Guinness and denying themselves furniture?
Tomorrow.
Peasants only had to pay a beard tax fee if they entered a city with a beard.
Yeah, it's pay as you go.
Go beards.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.
I'm historian Ruth Goodman, host of Noise's newest podcast, The Curious History of Your Home. I've spent my life investigating the hidden history of everyday objects. The vacuum cleaner in your cupboard, sleek and compact today, but when it was invented, it was literally powered by horses and took 4 to 6 people to operate. The minty fresh toothpaste by a sink. Well, if you lived in ancient Greece, you'd be washing your teeth with ground-up bones and oyster shells. Double-glazed windows? We owe those to a French king's odd fascination with oranges. The Curious History of Your Home explores the extraordinary in the ordinary. Listen to The Curious History of Your Home each Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. From award-winning podcasters Noiser, The Curious History of Your Home.